So, hello and welcome to What Makes a Difference. And today we are delighted to have Ceri Marsh in. And Ceri is the co-founder of B.R.E.A.C.H.E.D, community interest company.
Lovely to have you join us, Ceri.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here finally.
Absolutely.
We've been talking about it for ages and actually get on with it now.
Yeah. Can you tell us how you got involved with, or a bit about B.R.E.A.C.H.E.D and how you got involved with moral injury?
Right, so B.R.E.A.C.H.E.D is a very, very long process. That's, I don't know, there's so many strands that sort of came together at once. So I'm the daughter of a nuclear test veteran. Sadly, my father passed away in 1999 of a rare radiogenic cancer. And he didn't tell the family about this until I was about 14 when we were watching television and the Hiroshima detonation came on there. And I said, that's shocking. And he said, I've seen something like that. And I just stopped and said, what was that? And so he explained about his time at Maralinga in 1956, Operation Buffalo, and said he was standing there with his hands over his eyes. He was flown up from Edinburgh Field, where he was working, age 23, to specifically watch this bomb go off, Operation Buffalo at Kite. And then he was working on the aircraft, decontaminating them. And it was a whole new world opened up in front of me that he had been fearful because of the Official Secrets Act in saying anything. And then he trundled along through life and he came up with this cancer. And he was told from the outset it was terminal, esophageal adenocarcinoma and stomach. And he said, the government did this to me. And that was a big thing for him to say because he was such a passionate serviceman, been in for 22 years, served his country, loved being in the RAF. I loved him being in the RAF. My younger life, I was born at RAF Rawton Hospital, in and out of Lynham and Bryce and Boscombe Down, and loved it. And then to suddenly hear that the government did this to me, put a whole big thing through that. And so I started thinking about how you could be proud of your service and yet feel betrayed. And then basically he had got in touch through RAFA, put him in touch with the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association, with Ken McGinley, who sadly passed away last month, about a month ago. And Ken had been a veteran of Christmas Island, and he'd seen 5 detonations, and he'd signed up for 22 years, and he was medically discharged after 3 with a range of emotional problems. He collapsed in church one day. All he could see was hearing was thundering booms and flashing lights, and ended up on the floor. Had his stomach removed, 2/3 of his stomach removed by the age of 21. Had his records tampered with, ended up with polycythemia. There's a number of things. So my father was talking to Ken, and Ken was marvellous to him. And my father got worse and worse. And Ken was just trying to allay his fears and saying, we're fighting this, we're fighting this. And I realised my poor mother was in a terrible state with all of this. She couldn't cope with the thought the government had done this to Dad. But every which way you looked at it, it had happened. There had been a breach. And that's as far as it went until a couple of days before Dad died. And he said to me, do something about this. And I sat in the periphery for the next 20 years, really, having my own family, worried about each of my children as I was pregnant with them every day, that they could have some genetic effect of what Dad had been exposed to, and how he was let down, and that this was bigger than just him. It was to do with the whole family. And so I started reading up on this. So in my working life, I'm passionate about understanding people, seeing how they tick, and helping people. So I started off academically. I studied theology because I wanted to see what people believed and how they believed it and what their mindset was and their perceptions. And that led into social research, and that ultimately led into mental health psychology. So then in came ethics. And going along the line in 2020, I became involved with the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association, and joined as a trustee, soon as chair. And I'd been writing about the experiences of my father. And I wanted to put a title to it, and I couldn't think of what it was. It wasn't quite PTSD, but it was something like it. He got on with his job. I couldn't see him having any big flashbacks or anything like that. So I couldn't see him crippled over with a panic attack. But it had affected his outlook and the outlook of all of those around him. So he joined the Royal Observer Corps until that was disbanded in 91. So he'd disappear every Thursday evening down some bunker somewhere near us, but we didn't know where, because he couldn't cope with the thought of this happening over here, what he had experienced over in Australia. And basically, I think whether the moral injury was encapsulated for me by a lady from NHS England who I had looked up what I could try and make sense of. And what I found was some atomic veterans were interviewed by somebody called Henry Viner back in 1983, US atomic veterans. And he went around, and instead of doing all these statistical analysis, he went around and interviewed them and spoke to their families. And he coined something called radiation response syndrome. And so this, to me, summed up what I thought I was thinking about. So these men had come back from American tests and cleanups, and it had affected them over a period of time. It's probably about 8 to 10 years after they came back. They started having thoughts or a dream or a flashback or a worry. Their mood changed, their outlook changed, their relationship with their family changed. They could come in with addictions. They had shame of going. They were worried to talk to the family about what they'd been exposed to and if they'd brought any harm into the genetics pool. But there was nothing hard and fast to say, yes, you've been exposed to radiation. And I think what hit me was, it was the fear. It didn't matter as such about the exposure, although that does matter because of the physical effects, etc. of that. But it's the instilled fear. So I started talking about radiation response syndrome, and I started to understand from my perspective, from my family's perspective, that this was what my dad had been exposed to. And then somebody, as I say, had mentioned about moral injury. And I said, that's it. That's exactly it. So it's the betrayal. You've been betrayed institutionally by those who should have been giving you a duty of care. So my father standing there had multiple facets of moral injury. So he stood there in his shorts and his T-shirt, and he put his fists in his eyes. And that bomb went off. And then he was ordered to turn around and face the blast. Why would anybody do that to somebody? It's enough that bomb going off, but then being told as part of your orders to turn around and face the blast. Now, my father had always said to me, I said, weren't you worried? If you were telling me that you saw something like Hiroshima, weren't you worried about the effects on you? And he said, we were told we'd be fine. And because of that military conditioning, which has to happen, I understand that as a daughter of somebody who served, they were lied to. It was like you have this invisible protection because you're in the military. You can put up with anything and it doesn't have that effect. And seeing papers written over the years and papers that have been hidden and lies from the Ministry of Defence, I just have to say that there have been lies about everybody was fine. I've seen it on my father's application for his war pension. Yes, your cancers were radiogenic, they're on our list, but no, we're not going to pay you. We think you were fine. It's probably worth 2 x-rays that you were subjected to. But it's that mental fear that's permeated life invisibly. So with a moral injury, going back to that, so they were left with no protection. They were denied protection. They were told they would be fine. They were betrayed. And so we get back to, there was an act of commission, there was an act of omission, there was an act of betrayal. And as I've come to talk more about moral injury and learn more about moral injury from many different, because it's a multidisciplinary approach, this subject. Because like radiation, it's an invisible subject. So it's not classified as a disorder. So there's many differing versions of talking about moral injury, varying definitions from different academic institutions like King's. And I'm grateful now that the International Centre for Moral Injury started up at Durham University. And it was started up by Brian Powers, who served in the US Air Force. And he was a meteorologist. And what he saw as a meteorologist, which is a tame profession in Afghanistan and Iraq, really changed his outlook, his ethical outlook. And this is where the breach happens. And so he talks of, within their definition of moral injury, he talks about suppression as well. So people who feel they can't speak out, something's happened to them, whether it's my father being obedient to the Official Secrets Act, it causes a harm within because there's been a significant breach to that person. It ruptures their whole outlook, their core values, and makes a big effect in their life. So I started working with nuclear test veterans. I couldn't give any more to my father because he'd passed away. But talking to nuclear test veterans, I used to say to them, they'd talk and relay their experiences and go through. I stood there, had my hands over my eyes. And then you'd say to them, was there any point in your life where you really felt you couldn't cope? And they go, yes, there was. In 1982, I suddenly had this blackout one day and everything changed, or I couldn't stop crying. And they won't think of that because they are stiff upper lip servicemen who just carry on thinking it's just all in a day's work. They're not thinking about what's actually happened to them. It's so significant. And so the cleanup workers, as much as those who've watched these bombs be detonated, they haven't seen one moment of a massive flash, but they've acquired a fear of that radiation that they could have had, possibly had been subjected to or were subjected to, but it's changed them completely. And so Breached, I think, had been brewing. I'd been contacted by somebody who had been at Porton Down and was subjected to Sarin. And he'd worked with CBRN. So he knew the score and he was told, cure for the common cold, etc. I mean, that's a big whopper of something. And he went in there, took off the respirator, had these 2 drops of sarin on his hand, saying, I know what this is going to do to me. And they said, no, you'll be fine. Oh, we've heard that before. And he's still, oh, gosh, the harrowing look in his eyes at times is awful. It's so, so terrible what's happened to some of these people. And it is a moral injury. There's other injuries that come off that, but there's moral harm. And so I thought, well, I've got to do something. I can't claim one scandal for the nuclear test veterans because I'm hearing stories from people at B.R.E.A.C.H.E.D or Optelic, other things that have happened. The Rawalpindi experiments, where they tested mustard gas on thousands and thousands of Indian army in the 30s in mobile chambers and books of pictures of harm. And so I thought, well, it's bigger. So the scandal is the whole betrayal. Mm-hmm. I can't claim one thing. And so Breached came about through lots of discussion with friends. And I wanted to encompass the CBRN element. So Breached actually stands for, if you can go for this long title, biological, radiological, ethical abuse, chemical harm, and now we've changed it to environmental damage. And then it encompasses everything, basically. So although it's got that toxic emphasis, and because Michelle and I started at Breach, because Michelle's father was on the HMS Narvik at Operation Grapple in 1957, 58, we've got lived experience as daughters of nuclear test veterans. We've got that understanding. We've both got psychology backgrounds. And we thought we've got something to offer. We want to hear from people. We want to help them. That's ultimately what it's all about. And moral injury, and I'm sure you're aware as much as I am, it's a collective, it's an individual harm, but it's a collective harm to a group of people generally. Talk about the post office, sub-postmasters.
Yeah.
All this, there's no smoke without fire, is not necessarily true. You can have a bad dose of harm where it should not have been. And so it's about coalescing people together so they've got their peers and they can be in a safe space and talk. And unlike PTSD, it's not as if we're going to say, right, tell us everything that happened. We're not about that, because that could cause more harm with moral injury. But it's about listening to them as they want to talk or not talk, and advocating for them with the government. I've sat with the government before now. I've sat with the Office of Veterans Affairs, with the Cabinet Office Director, and shown pictures of harm that's been caused to nuclear test veterans. I've sat there and explained moral injury, and I've seen genuine tears from those that are in charge. And that makes a difference to me. And I think there's a whole lot more dialogue that needs to happen within duty of care.
Just for the listeners, CBRN is chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear.
It is, in that order.
It is. They think so that, like the mustard gas testing, the nuclear testing, they knew exactly what that was all about from the First World War. What's the point of doing these experiments again and again?
I don't know. I was sent by the curator of the Hiroshima Peace Institute. He'd sent me a paper which was dated 1948, Bikini Atoll time. And it said that they wanted to test the psychological fear on the troops. And so there's added dimensions to all of these testing, and a lot of it is fear tactics, I think. If it's conditioning, I don't know how, what's the word, how open that was, if that was a byproduct of the first pieces of testing. Because they obviously wanted to test on the civilians. When you think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you're talking the testing of a uranium bomb, a plutonium bomb, different geographical location, but both on civilian cities. So it's all about testing.
Yeah, and there's also the testing by our governments on local populace, wasn't it? Spreading spores of so-called benign agent.
Absolutely, the Lyme Bay trials. The more I've learned about the spores from where I'm living in Swindon, we're surrounded by biological testing. E. coli, anthrax, simulants. They were just dropped out of aircraft by night. Nobody knew. They didn't tell the population. But these things continued for years into the 70s. It doesn't make things right. I think we've all turned into subjects as Grunard Island. It's amazing. Some of those nuclear tests in the early days were set to take place in the UK. And going into history, they were sent over to Australia. So from 1952, 53 at Emu Field, the early test should have taken place at Duncansby Stacks up in Caithness, and thankfully weren't. But they were sent to Montebello Island, and there was an arrangement with Menzies in Australia, who was such a Churchillian, he just wanted to do anything the British wanted and bring it to the Commonwealth. And of course, the Commonwealth was your testing ground. You could go anywhere and do anything. And he set 80 kilotons as a maximum. And G2 at the Montebello Islands was 98 kilotons. There's scientific papers to say it, but the government documents still say it's 60 kilotons. But we have Aldermaston papers saying it is 98. So they exceeded. It was a very weird time of this testing. You're blending military with science. And so there was a lot of argumentation going on between who was running what. The scientists wanted to run the tests because they had the technical know-how, but the military were actually performing the tests. And it makes me wonder now, move forward into time, and there's the question mefloquine, squalene in vaccinations for military. Stand there, put your arm out on the runway. We're just going to give you a few vaccinations before you fly off, but they don't tell you what it is.
Well, the guys who went out in the first Gulf, they were just injected with so many vaccines in a matter of days.
Yeah. They were, and they've lived to tell the tale. Some of them, not all of them. Larium, and, within a couple of hours.
I've heard that there's children who've been passed on genetic defects from that, potentially.
Yeah. It's terrible. So many people have taken their lives.
Mm-hmm.
1 minute they're you're a fine, fit military person, peak of health, and the next is I'm going mad. And it's neurobiological effects, which are seen as psychiatric effects. And they can't cope anymore. And it's terribly, terribly sad to see. So there is a harm there, which is far bigger than a moral injury, because it's got the physical effects to it, the biological effects. But there's not the backup. And I know, when you sign up and it could be the last thing you do. You can lose your life in combat, but you don't expect your own side to not quite dot the I's and cross the T's that can cause such harm.
Yeah, there's a duty of care.
Yes.
Or supposed to be by the government or the uncivil service towards the serving personnel.
Yes. And the fight goes on for decades. What happened with Ken McGinley from 1983? He was writing to his newspaper to try and get a little article in there saying, I've seen hell, basically. I've witnessed these bombs. It's not normal to be putting people in front of that and then saying, right, get up, carry on, as you were. It's not right. There will always be a repercussion. Yeah. And sadly, for a lot of people, it's, as I say, veterans I know now in their late 80s and their 90s, and it's as important to them today as it was in 1956, 57. And there are family effects, vicarious effects, all the way around their way. Wives who develop complex PTSD and don't know why.
It's not vicarious trauma.
Yeah, exactly. Complete trauma. As I say, my 3 pregnancies were marked every day with thinking, what if to do? And I don't know how worried, people are generally with pregnancy. And I'm sure that everybody's got worries, but every day you're thinking, what if that genetic effect from dad at those tests?
That's a burden to carry.
It is. It is. And then saying to the kids one day about Grandad was exposed to this. And my eldest son, he couldn't cope with that at all. So you live with a fear, getting back to radiation response syndrome, that anything medical you pick up could be to do with that. And we're talking 2 generations down, let alone those who were born without a bowel or had things that you're thinking, oh, that's got to be to do with the nuclear test, but you can never say for absolutely sure that that is. But it instills this fear into your very fabric of being that's not right. There's a lot of hurting people out there.
Yeah,
I think,
and it's a matter of being there for them.
Do you think, Ceri, that part and parcel of that injury? Because I do like the word breached in relation to that, because I think it's very accurate. It's a breaching of trusts. It's a breaching of faiths in terms of your relationship with the world, the organisation, the people around about you, the situation. But do you think it's also, there's an element there of responsibility, acknowledgement, and culpability that, when avoided, also impacts in terms of worth and value? And that worth and value, the undervaluing, the underworthing of something that has been given with such intention and commitment, in itself an additional injury. It's almost like, if you can breach and fail to acknowledge and fail to take responsibility, what does it actually mean for the worth and the recognition of my commitment?
Well, absolutely. And that shows the nuclear test veterans that 70 years after the first atomic test at Operation Hurricane, that the Prime Minister said there'd be a medal. And then, although that's pleased a number of veterans, there's always been that question. It's a commemorative medal. It's not a service medal. It's not an operational medal. And when they learn that, it doesn't make a difference to some veterans, but other veterans are really quite cross about that, because that doesn't really show their worth.
Yeah. It's denying what they've gone through. It's when we talked with Leo Quinlan and Marty and what their fathers experienced on return from Janetville, that denial by the Irish government, by the UN, of what they'd gone through.
Yeah.
And it made them feel not worthless. And going back to what you're saying with your mother not recognising your father as you're coming through, that's what Marty was saying about his mum, said about his dad. You've brought the wrong man home. Who is this man who's come back?
Yeah. Yeah. And because it's such a personal inner thing, you're not thinking, I've been breached, I've been betrayed. You get on with the job. And it's a very lonely, solitary thing. A lot of people, I guess, will fill their life with other things, thinking they can cope and get on with life. And they can.
In a way, it's a bit, I would suggest it's a dislocation.
Yeah, yeah.
You become dislocated from those around you. You become dislocated from your own values.
Yes.
Your own sense of right and wrong. I would agree. I think that's that isolation element. And when you have that dislocation, how do you even begin to explain that? And explain the impact of that? You know, those are very specific words to try and put that across, especially when you are in that point of dislocation.
Because it's institutional as well. So you're one voice against a big institution, i.e. the government. And you can explain yourself, and they don't really listen. We were talking earlier, weren't we, before this began, about the helicopter pilots and the toxins that they're exposed to. And those that have lost their lives, like Guy McNaughton, he went in 3 weeks with a rare blood vessel cancer from a, tough squadron leader to sadly passed away. He's got no voice now, but that's a very moral injury, that there's a problem with those helicopters.
Yeah, would you mind explaining what that problem is, Ceri?
Oh, I don't know the technical side of it, Rich. You can put me on the spot.
My limited understanding is with the sea
emissions.
Yeah. And emissions are coming into that helicopter. They could pay for pumps to be able to extract those emissions, but they're not. And so those fumes are coming in, and obviously
they're
the guys
coming in and affecting the crew. But it's where you sit, isn't it? So those at the front, i.e. the pilot, it was the same with the nuclear test. It's where you sit in that flying machine, basically.
That comes back to that acknowledgement and ownership, isn't it? And if there's no acknowledgement and ownership, there's no culpability there. What does that mean for the value?
Exactly.
And that not only do you have the very real physical loss, but there's a degradation of value there as well.
Absolutely. And there's various ways you can look at it. So it's inflicted on somebody else, whether they like it or not, because it's basically moral injury shouldn't happen. It's a quality assurance thing. If things were done properly and checks were made, it shouldn't happen.
I think the nature of being human, moral injury will happen, but things like the helicopters, things like the nuclear testing, they shouldn't be happening.
Absolutely.
Can I make a distinction in that maybe the nature of life, moral bruising happens?
Absolutely, I agree. So every situation, you've got a moral about yourself.
And I suppose because the debate is how we use that word moral injury, because there has to be a recognition of the sheer size and the importance of the impact of that.
Yeah.
And if we use it too readily, then it almost dilutes the power of those words. And those words deserve to be powerful.
They do. So,
which is why I'm almost saying, is that almost that there are shades within there, and we need a range of language. And I think, Rich, you and I were having that conversation the other day, weren't we? You'd shared some information you'd come across about that, almost the
discomfort,
the discomfort, distress, injury.
Yeah.
And that's that sense of your morals, your connection can be bruised, but has it been fully breached? It might be breached in a section, but not in its entirety. But when it gets to the point of the things that we're discussing just now with you, Ceri, that's an entire dislocation. It's a size and scope, isn't it?
So where I am, I told you what I studied in life, and I started off with theology. I'm soon to start a course in contemporary ethics, looking from philosophical and ethical point of view, to come back to theological, to come back to psychological. It's my own journey in this. Now, I'm coming from that, the point of view where I've examined all sorts of things in my life, and I've come back to Christianity. And what I've tried to do is look at moral injury within the Bible. And there's a lot of moral injury in the Bible. Biggest thing was Jesus on the cross. But what I've come down to is a couple of little verses. So a lot of the time, there's soul and spirit are synonymous in the Bible. At other times, they're separate, just a couple of occasions. And talking in a secular point of view as opposed to a religious point of view, you can talk about a conscience. You have your own morals. We have our own value system. We have the UN telling us, we got human rights within this. So it's set out post World War II. And then there's a little verb in Proverbs, a little verse even, on about broken spirit. And I like that, because to me, I think that encapsulates for me the sadness of this, the wrongness of this,
the loss of this.
the loss. Exactly. That's exactly where it is. And that's what I'm looking to study, is about broken spirits and the meaning of that for so many different people. It really is a humbling sadness.
I think there's a blend, isn't there, quite often, of a sheer outrage mixed with grief.
Yes, yeah, and that's a big word in this. It is the grief. And you don't really know, grief can come up and wallop you out of the blue. And you could be fine for weeks. I mean, even now, my parents are saying my father died 25 years ago. I can have a moment of terrible sadness, and then it seems to have gone again. But it's always there in your psyche, isn't it? Somewhere, sitting there.
And it's also you keep what you're saying, Ali, as well, isn't it? So you could have gone on for a period of time carrying this burden. Then as a point of realization, go, oh, this has happened to me, and that's just wrong.
Yeah, it's like sometimes often the point of injury isn't the point of the event, it's point of realization of the wrongness of it, is that because that's the point of dislocation. That's the point of separation, where you're ripped apart from everything that anchors you.
Yes, it might not be at that moment in time, like PTSD.
Then it's the realization of the impact of that point where you stop and you go, well, what does that then mean? It's a shifting of your truths and the relationships of those truths. In order for this to be true, what does that mean for this?
So I've mentioned Ken McGinley, who started up the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association, how helpful he was with my father between 1997 and 99. And I didn't speak to Ken then until 2021, and I phoned him up. I was very, very nervous about that phone call. He spoke to thousands of nuclear test veterans and their families and collected health data, which has been invaluable over the years. He was given the title of Hibakusha by the Japanese Congress, the first international person to be given that. He met with the Chernobyl firefighters, and I thought, I'm going to have to talk to Ken and mention moral injury to him. Now, if I went to, from experience, I've spoken to nuclear test veterans, and they've said, you think we're all mad? And I said, no, not at all. Not at all. I'm not talking in that way at all. But I said, so this is the point. I introduced the term of moral injury. And as soon as I did that, they went, oh, that's me. And Ken did the same. He said, I know exactly what you're on about. This is what I've had all these years.
Yeah. And I wonder what difference that makes to know that term, that phraseology, to put a label on something that you've never been able to.
One, they're very happy it's not a condition classed as that. Two, they know they're one of hundreds or thousands of people who've got the same.
Well, I think sometimes what I find is at that point of understanding what this is, it's almost like that's the first step of recreating worth.
Yes.
Because it's the capacity to say, it's not just me.
Yes.
And that means that I don't have to own all of it as a judgment of my worth. This actually maybe isn't to do with my worth at all. But is it something separate from that? Doesn't mean to say that you don't still have that outrage and that dislocation. It's starting to acknowledge the capacity for you still to have worth.
Exactly. And I think it brings you to a point of acknowledgement, whereas you could just come in as an angry person. You can actually go, well, that's part of me. That's my rupture of my core values. But that's that. I can park it there and experience it, but I know it's something and it's not me per se.
Yeah. So
and I think there's a coping mechanism in that.
Yeah, we've come up with a metaphor or an analogy, and that's like you're walking along, you've got this bread in like a bread tin.
Yeah.
And as you're walking along through life, you get these birds come around pecking at your bread. Or you get one like big bird comes down, swoops in, takes a whole loaf of bread out. And then you're walking along quite merrily in some regard. And all of a sudden you look down at your tin, your loaf where the bread was, and all that's left is crumbs in that hollow tin where that was. And you go, what's happened?
Yeah.
And
yeah, because you look after the fact, don't you? You don't feel that at the time.
And that bread is your value, your belief, your worth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sense of who you are in relation to everything else round about you. And that comes back to that injury is the point of realization when you've spent so long trying to protect that and hold that together, when you finally look and realize what is there.
Absolutely. And as you say, it's different to a bruising. It is a full injury, but it does take that time to come out. Mm-hmm. And I think it's with actually recognizing it has got a term to it, and it may have made a massive difference to your life in whatever way, and brought in those feelings of shame and anger and loss and grief and abandonment and feeling cut off. It's you can cope through it collectively with others, not even talking about those experiences, but actually being with peers who've had it. You may not, as I say, talk about it at all.
Well, I think if I look at that distress, discomfort, injury piece, I think the majority of us at some point in our life, if not all, will have moral discomfort.
Yes.
It's part of living. It's part of how we learn and define our own morality. Is those decision points where we either go, I'm comfortable with this, I'm really not sure if I'm comfortable with this. It's almost like us assessing our own boundaries. That moral distress may also happen to a sizable percentage of our population, but it might only impact on a small or limited aspect of our life. It might only impact on a limited aspect of our worth in relation to that part of our life, but not necessarily all of it. Moral injury is the entire dislocation.
Yes. It's like you've lost your pivot. You are looking through different eyes.
It's like your anchor points to what you know to be true have just imploded.
Yes. And a lot of what you do within life is coping through that blindly to some degree, because you don't realize what it is you got. But I don't think you can ever heal that breach. But I think you can come towards a healing and a coping within that breach.
Yeah. I think just an injury. I think there's a certain amount of recovery from that, whatever that recovery looks like for different people. It's going to be.
Well, I think. I mean, Rich, you and I have talked about this often, is that point of, and one of the first analogies I ever came up with for that was almost the jigsaw pieces. Somebody's imploded your jigsaw, and some sods come along, cut the bobbly bits off that join the pieces back together again. So no matter what you do, they don't fit. But actually the knack is to recognise that maybe they're not jigsaw pieces anymore, maybe they're mosaics. They're mosaic tiles.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
So it's not about trying to recreate something that was there before.
Yes.
It's what do I do with this now? Because it's those anchor points. They don't have to be the same anchor points. They don't have to be the same points of connection. They just need to be connection and anchor points.
Yeah.
So don't try and recreate. Create.
Yeah. You can't undo what's happened.
No.
But you can make use of how you live your life with knowing yourself better, those around you better, and dealing with the individual moments that you get. But it is a long lasting effect. There's no short term with the moral injury. You can't just turn your back on it.
Yeah, no. I'm curious, Ceri, have you managed to be able to interview or speak to people who actually ordered these events to be carried out?
I've spoken to scientists, And they were told, everybody says, oh, we were told this or we were told that. We didn't know. So even within Aldermaston, there's one scientist, he's in his 90s, and he's given us his memoirs, but we're not allowed to read them until he's passed away. And I suspect in there's a few little bits and bobs. It's a very sobering experience knowing this. But yes, we've heard from people who said they weren't happy with what they've done. I mean, William Penny himself in the Australian Commission, he came to all sorts of ethical moments, much like Oppenheimer did. Look what happened with Oppenheimer. There was a real rupture there, and he stood up against, after realizing how everything was science to him, how it was used. Well, he knew full well what it was going to be used for, but it sent him into a very unhappy person, put it that way.
I think sometimes there's a difference between the knowing, because you can know something, conceptualize something, but it's still quite abstract. But when that moves from being abstract to actual, then there's also a shift in terms of, I might have acknowledged and known that this was going to happen beforehand, but now it has, and that's a whole different experience.
So James Chadwick was at Liverpool, and ICI, Wig Island, and they'd done a lot of development for mustard gas there. There's another whole moral injury with the workers from Wig Island and around Runcorn, and that they had a lot of sores on their bodies and died at a very young age. If they lived to past 50, it was categorized as quite rare. And the government was supposed to be dealing with their medical issues, and they refused, knowing that there would be a claim there. And this is a problem with moral injury. A lot of it was there should be a claim there. Mm-hmm. But going back to James Chadwick, who was in charge of this, he was sent over to the Manhattan Project out in the United States. And he was an amazing man. He was an amazing scientist, and he discovered the neutron. He had the cyclotron, if I got that right, outside Liverpool Met Cathedral, and he did a lot for good. But from the second he got back from the Manhattan Project, the Trinity test and Hiroshima, he could never sleep right again. Mm. The breach was there. Mm-hmm. And all of his life, and he lived to an old man, it ruptured him. He never thought, as I say, you can't use an excuse of science and advancement to cause destruction and not know what you're doing. But I think some of those scientists walked off that project beforehand.
But that's that abstract to actual, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they've obviously now released Pandora's box, as it were, and you can't close it.
No, it's released. And I find it quite interesting. I mean, there's so many aspects to this, because you're talking about CBRN issues, back to that again. So even within, I read yesterday that CND, who were against anti-establishment or classed as that by just being against nuclear weapons, had wanted to put posters up on the London Underground a few years ago, and they were told they couldn't. And now London Underground has said, yes, please do. And I think it's because we're all under that threat of moral injury, because we're all sitting there under this fear of a nuclear threat, which it could be more imminent than we think. And yes, Pandora's box, the lid has been taken off. So it could be a mass moral injury before we know it. Nobody's immune from it.
No.
But it's a very invisible thing. As I say, much like radiation, that's the only thing I can say about it on that front. But it's very personal.
But I think that invisibility, in a way, is part of the size of the impact of it.
Yeah.
Because how do you explain to somebody that actually I don't know how to connect with my values and my world anymore? I don't know how to build these relationships or what faith I can put in these relationships. Because we can talk about faith from a religious concept, or we can talk about it as a wider concept that says my faith in the alignment of my values with the rest of the world round about me. My faith in the morality of everybody else that I come into contact with, on their capacity to acknowledge and take ownership and responsibility, and what that means in terms of my interactions, my worth, my agreements.
Yeah.
If I lose all faith in that, where does that place me, apart from in a place of utter dislocation?
Yeah, it's a strange one, isn't it? I was writing the other day about whatever your views are on how this world came to be, about man's destruction on creation. And yet man created that destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's from putting somebody in front of an atomic bomb or putting 2 drops of sarin on their wrist, or allowing them to lie in bags of toxic chemicals in a water treatment facility in Basra for 3 months, doing their duty and breathing that in. There's a lack of duty of care, but the consequences and the repercussions of that are very deep. And I spoke to a lovely person. He's 40 years old, and he was out in Basra, RAF regiment. And he was sent in. He didn't go to Kuwait. He went straight into this water treatment facility. And he lay about. There's snipers at them there. There are 86 of them. Some of them have died now at a young age. They weren't given any protection. And they had to lie in where all these bags, there are hundreds and hundreds of bags of this. I'm going to get the chemical wrong now, but it's very bright yellow, sodium hydroxate or something like that. And they lived and breathed this with no protection, and started getting sores and the rest of it. And he could cope telling me all of this. And I said, how are you and your family? And he burst into tears, and he went, I don't know the effects, if I've had effects on my kids. You know, and he goes thinking of things much like this radiation response syndrome, saying, when I had COVID, everybody else in the family was okay. I nearly died with my breathing. I'm sure it's to do with this. I get nosebleeds nearly every day, big nosebleeds. I never got them before. And so any physical effect you have from anything is blamed on this, which may be caused by or not caused by. The likelihood is it is, but it's changed that way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And it's a massive spiritual rupture to the individual, because it cuts so through. It's got that, as I say, that invisible dimension of within.
Weren't there civil contractors with those rough reg guys, and they were given protection?
They were, yeah. The Americans were in first until, I think it was May. And the Americans, a lot of those, they haven't been given compensation as far as I know. And a lot of them died, but they were given PPE by the time they left, the latter stages. I read, there was a Sky News expose on this, and they said there was a sign put up in Arabic and English saying toxic chemicals. He said, I never saw a sign. And from the second they were there, because the Iraqis had sabotaged this water treatment facility. So it was high pressure water going to the oil fields. And of course, they wanted to cut everything off. And so they sabotaged it, and they were snipers everywhere. So these men were lying on their stomachs for most of the time. They were eating in there, drinking in there, they were sleeping in there on the floor for those 3 months, and feeling ill from the outset. But they weren't given any PPE. They were just in their, short sleeves and shorts, trousers, covered in it. It was in their water. It was in everything. And of course, there's not going to be a day that they don't think of that. No, they knew that you could get sent in for warfare, into combat, And you still have memories of that and an effect from that. You're trained for that. But for that not to be risk assessed properly, it's arguable. People will say, well, you couldn't know that because...
Yeah, but that was an avoidable risk.
It was, as far as I could see, it's avoidable. And so his teenage kids, he's convinced, have got some genetic issue. Let alone the strain on his wife. He thinks he's going to die early, much like my father. All of this. Oh, it's going to be the end of me. And it compounds with a vicarious effect of something that's untreated. And we're talking about it's not a disorder.
No.
It's an experience, a very deep experience that has this lasting effect. But it affects the family, and the whole family can become very hostile, even for people who are trying to help them.
But I think these conversations, Ceri, are also really important, because the number of people that we work with, where they may have a formal diagnosis for PTSI, complex PTSI, for a range of other issues, but the moral injury has never been acknowledged.
No.
And as a result, it's almost kind of, there's an element where that has to be addressed and adjusted and resolved in whatever way you can. Otherwise, it almost sits there like an invisible entry point to reoccurrence of your trauma experiences, of the trauma responses that you've got, because that part is still active and unaddressed. You're still dislocated and unanchored. And I don't know what you feel, but it's almost kind of like, for me, those contact points, those agreements, those understandings, they're really vital in terms of navigating your life and your space, because those are the basis for all of the other agreements. And if you don't have that, and you have no faith in that and a dislocation from that, how do you even begin to create those other agreements that create your community, your relationships, your faiths, your trusts, your beliefs, your value set in relation to other people?
It could work the other way, couldn't it, Ali? Surely moral injury then should be the easiest thing to establish. If somebody says, I went into that water treatment facility with no PPE and I was lying on my stomach on the floor for 3 months, etc., you say, well, there was an act of omission that comes under moral injury. So it's easier to look at. I'm as cautious then not to say the word diagnose.
But is it though? Because actually, not everybody that has that experience may have a moral injury.
I think out of those particular men, I think all of them do. And they're very, some of them I know won't speak about it because they've got such terrible health issues now.
I'm not discounting that, Ceri. All I'm saying is that for moral injury, it's such a personal experience and a personal dislocation that what dislocates one person may not impact another in the same way. Now, it's very much the same, you could argue, for trauma as well. It is. And having one does not necessarily mean that you automatically have the other. They can operate independently and separately, but they are very different animals and very complex.
Yeah, absolutely.
In some ways, yes, I would agree, very simple. In others, the impact of that is very complex.
It is very complex. That's what I mean. It's simple in its own way, that I was subjected to something that shouldn't have happened, and this is why, because it breached that. But it's got a whole network of complexities, much like you're in a system, really, of how everything's knit together, and the repercussions and how that comes out. And all I can do, from my perspective, and Michelle's, is to talk to people and advocate for them and stick up for injustice with that. And signposts where necessary, really. Support them individually.
In a way, that's kind of like what when we're talking with Kim Bond, when she did her research with adults who've been abused or neglected or whatever as children.
Yeah.
Her findings was the main thing they wanted was some form of justice.
Yeah.
And I think that's also an acknowledgement of what that person has gone through as well, which validates their experience. And as you said earlier, Ali, it gives that person some self-worth back again.
Yeah. It's not campaigning in the sense of campaigning. It's more pointing out and saying, can you sit across a table from me and let's have a conversation and create that understanding, much as I've managed to do partially with the Office of Veterans Affairs in the past couple of years. And yet, we're sitting there in the wet at the National Memorial Arboretum with Rishi Sunak standing there. He came in the last minute, and Ben Wallace and Johnny Mercer. And I was being rushed here and there, saying the Prime Minister's here. He's going to do this. He's going to give a medal. And you're sitting there waiting for his speech. And he stops short of an apology. He does the government spin on, thank you for giving us a nuclear deterrent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it's about. When really, we're back to that word about being aggrieved by, and it's not enough. And I think even that confirmation or affirmation that something has happened and shouldn't have done can help with moral injury.
It can, but I think the sad truth with that is a lot of that comes down to money. Because if you acknowledge that, if you acknowledge and take ownership of that, then that also means what do you do next in terms of reparation, in terms of that sorry, in terms of that apology.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of talking.
Let's not bother with that acknowledgement that we've done anything worth, because that might get a bit expensive.
Yeah.
That's kind of like the guys who flew in Bomber Command. They were hailed as heroes during the war. And then for years and years afterwards, there's no acknowledgement. And it wasn't until they started dying off to go, actually, you deserve a medal for what you did.
Yes. And how difficult is that to give a medal? Because when I put in the application, actually, for the nuclear test veterans, and I was back and forth to the advisory military subcommittee, and you have to prove that there was risk and rigour. And I had a letter back from Charles Winstanley saying it was novel conditions these men were in. It was such a weird letter to say, we're coming short of saying that they can have a medal. It was novel conditions. Oh, yeah, putting somebody in front of a nuclear bomb with no protection, 3 megatons, on you go. Yeah, that's novel. It's terrible. But they can give medals for all sorts of things.
Yeah. I wonder what would happen if they decided to put the whole civil service in front of some 3 megaton nuclear bomb.
That I may have mentioned that, Rich. Yeah. I may have been in one.
We're just going to try a little experiment now.
Exactly. If you're that happy about it, but I saw that.
Imagine the invite, Ceri, dear Rishi, we cordially invite you to. We reserved front row seats for you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to have a moral moment today when I go into that, do my voting, I must admit. That's but yeah, they had the Bomber Command application came in the same time as the nuclear test veterans, and that was rejected. And the ground crew for the Berlin airlift, that was rejected. What do you have to do to be, and like I say, it's an acknowledgement, it goes somewhere.
Yeah. It's kind of like when the application's going for a VC, if we give too many of these out, then it devalue the worth of that medal.
Yes,
and that's exactly. Why the British military, in a way, it's quite good that we don't get that many medals, but also in a way, it's also bad that we don't have that acknowledgement of, as you say, the Berlin airlift, the guys and gals who fought or were there during the Cold War, the test veterans, the Bomber Command, and all these sort of people who did all this stuff. It's just no acknowledgement of it.
Well, it was funny, actually, because there was a paper, there were some minutes of a meeting in 2013 at the MOD. And I managed to get hold of these minutes and they were redacted. And then I went online and somebody had actually put them on there unredacted. And it was great. And they say, well, how are you mentioning this? And they actually said, because there was an application again for Cold War medal, and they said, oh, there'd be far too many to give out. Look at the cost of the Ministry of Defence.
That's what yeah, I'm a bit cynical, but that's what they do. It's so late in the day is that most of these people have died off and go, oh, we only have to give a dozen.
Well, this is it. I mean, I was fighting for war pensions for all the nuclear test veterans because there's so few left now. You know, every week there'd be a few less. But they can't seem to have the civility to do that. It's about proving which area you were in. I've sat in war pension tribunals in an adjournment hearing, and the judge shouting at me saying, how do you know he was in the blue area? And I said, look, I'm talking about a man who had bedwetting at night after these bombs and screaming while he was at Christmas Island. He had a range of conditions, and all they were interested in is proving about the radiation. They, funnily enough, it wasn't funny for him. He, when Grapple Z went off, it set a few tents on fire. This was on a Pathé News film, actually. It did all sorts of things, the balloon bombs. And he managed to get a bit of shrapnel and went into his neck by his jugular. And they tried to make out in this tribunal to me that it wasn't from the bomb. I said, I don't care what it was from. It doesn't normally happen that way. A piece of aluminium from a bit of roof or something goes into your jugular. But what actually happened, and we found out years later, he went in for a quadruple heart bypass, and they found this was near his heart. It had gone all the way down. So the consultant was absolutely ever so nice about it and said, I'm retired now, but I'll give you any evidence you want. And they didn't want to listen to this, the MOD, because all they were interested in was that caused by that bomb? Well, yes, it was, but it wasn't part of that bomb. So they didn't want to know. And this man is 87 years old. You're thinking, just give him the pension.
Yeah,
and they still can't do it.
I guess what they're concerned about is, given the pension, then there'll be other claimants in because you set precedent, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
I've acknowledged for you, so I have to acknowledge for everybody, and shit, damn, that'll cost money.
Exactly.
It stinks.
It does stink. And yet, going back to the subject of moral injury, he'd suffered that. That's where he had the bedwetting. And when you go for the war pension, of course he's not wetting his bed now all those years later. But at that time, he was so freaked with that.
That's fear.
That's from his own side.
That's fear.
Bomb.
That's terror.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He was in the hospital a few times. And these were the bits he'd forgotten to put on there. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think he wanted to look at them, and his wife didn't know. And yeah, sheer terror.
Well, you see that a lot with people who go for help and support with their mental health, and they come back with a general anxiety disorder diagnosis.
Yes. Because
they don't, when in actual fact, you could almost argue that they're textbook post-traumatic stress.
Yes.
But on the day, they've been asked about what they're experiencing, and maybe they've had a good day. Or they're embarrassed about saying the full extent of what they experience regularly.
Well, look at the questions they ask for generalised anxiety disorder. And have you experienced this every day for 6 months or most days? Well, yes, I have. All right, then tick.
Or they think that maybe they don't have the recognition that this is actually what you're asking because the language is unfamiliar. So they can't place it in terms of the context of their experiences. And then they end up with a diagnosis that says, yeah, you're just a wee bit anxious.
Well, the person also may not have the language to describe that experience either. Mm-hmm. And the language they do describe it in isn't your textbook, this is this and this.
No.
It's their own words, it's their own metaphor.
So it doesn't relate to the experience of the person sitting there with a text sheet thinking, you're not? Well, no, sorry, you're not. Mm-hmm.
A man contacted me one day who's very senior person of a very big corporate company that everybody knows about. And his father-in-law was a nuclear test veteran, and he got very keen on talking. And he said, right, we're going to talk to him about this at Sunday dinner and about what you can offer him, etc., and the family. And so, knowing he was a nuclear test veteran and everything, they sat there on the Sunday dinner. And I got a phone call on the Monday morning, first thing, and I said, "Are you okay?" Because I said, "You don't sound too good." And he said, "I've never seen anything like it." He said, "We sat there and we mentioned about what you could do to help him, etc., and be in support." He said, and my father-in-law just sat there and let out the biggest wail. He said, "I've never heard a noise like it of his life." And I think in that wail, he articulated everything that happened at Christmas Island. Yeah. He didn't have to sit there and say, "I experienced this and this and this and this." It was just one noise. And the family didn't know what to do.
It's interesting you say that, because Rich and I, we were talking about that recently. It's like one of the things we described it as is it's almost like that scream of anguish from the soul that's so intense it shatters and dislocates, and it's almost like you get caught in that moment, that frozen in that moment of that scream.
Yes. And it's awful. And you think that man's lived with that. He probably hasn't. Well, I can't make judgments on that. I think he's just tried to get on with life and tried not to think of these things and had his family and etc. But you can't escape what's inside. And for some of these poor men, I mean, the government paper was done. They did 4 studies into the nuclear test veterans. And this was Ken McGinley pushing this to happen from 1983. And the last study came out, and the statistics I wanted to look at, people talk about cancers, and there are cancers. I say my father died of cancer. But what was awful was over half the people, I don't have the statistics on me now, that out of this group at Christmas Island, within 10 years of those that died, put it that way, over half of them had died of self-inflicted harm. Now, that's not normal, even by veteran standards.
No, it's not.
And that was like it was around 300 people, 148 of them or so had died of self-inflicted harm. ICD classification, suicide. And of those veterans that are alive, so the data that was collected, I asked lots of questions about what could be harnessed, and there was an increase in cerebrovascular disease. And I think my theory, and again, you can never go, it's because of that. Strokes, embolisms, there could be more rumination, more substance misuse, all sorts of reasons. Worry, that doesn't, the underestimation of worry, stress can have that impact on your physical health. And that's because of those moments of witnessing those bombs. Or it was the same in the radiation cleanup workers, as I say. So they didn't have to see the bomb, but just being around there, working in that environment would be the same.
So if you had to leave our listeners with some key points, Ceri, things that you would like them to take away and recall from our conversation today, what would those be?
If you feel there's been a breach to your core values, it's a fiddly topic to talk about. It's very simple and very complex at the same time. So call it your morals, call it your ethics, call it your inner feelings. If you feel that you've been breached there, please talk to somebody. And I'm not necessarily telling you to talk about your experiences, because within moral injury, that could be more harmful. But do reach out to Rich or Ali or Breached or any other group where you can, and get a bit of support. Check in with them. Because with moral injury, as I say, it's an individual harm, but it is, if there's going to be a healing, it's generally collective. And these days, with social media and communication the way it is, you can easily find peers. And that's where things start, is people getting together. And whether you want to go forth and attack the system, or just talk to somebody, or just know that you matter to somebody else, that's where it starts. So that's what I'd say, really. And it's just little steps.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more, Ceri. I think it's been a very sobering chat.
It has. Yeah, but I think it's been a really excellent chat. Thank you. It's always
vital.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. It's been a long time coming, hasn't it? I've been here, there, and everywhere. But I've found it really useful too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ace what you do, getting people on there and getting the stories out and things that matter. Thank you.
I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, Ceri.
Thank you.